Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the stories in some of our favorite games and ask the tough questions to figure out what is right and what is wrong. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're stepping back into the 19th century to saddle up alongside Arthur Morgan and the Vanderlin gang in Red Dead Redemption 2. In case you've missed any of the previous episodes in the Philosophy and Ethics series, I've linked a playlist in the description down below. As I continue to break down this and other games, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. Red Dead Redemption 2 was released on October 26, 2018, and garnered massive praise for its storytelling and graphical design. The massive open world brings players into a fictional version of the Wild West, spanning from an homage to New Orleans in the east known as Saint Denis to the unforgiving cold and snow of the Grizzlies, across the beautiful plains of West Elizabeth and over the vast deserts of New Austin. You can hunt, fish, hold up stagecoaches and banks, and live the life of an outlaw in the Wild West. Well, you can live the outlaw life for a short while at least. See, in 1899, the way of the outlaw was coming to an end. The far-reaching hand of modern society was stretching across the land, bringing laws and civilization to places and people that were far from tame. Organizations like the Pinkerton Detective Agency were hired to round up those who fought the new ways, and only a handful of outlaw gangs were holding on as the century prepared to turn. One of those gangs was led by a man known as Dutch Vanderlin. They'd been causing havoc in the West for years, and early in 1899 they found themselves in the small town known as Blackwater, running the usual scams and searching for ways to make enough money to buy some land of their own further out west. But things were about to take a bad turn for the group, as the decision to rob a ferry would end with Dutch shooting a young girl, forcing the gang to uproot and flee east into the Grizzly Mountains during a snowstorm. Several members were caught or killed in the chaos, but those who survived got the worst of it, as they would be hunted over the coming months, leading to the gang's ultimate demise in the end. Today, we'll be looking at the first part of their downfall, and over the next few weeks, we'll be dissecting what went wrong and picking apart their way of life, while comparing the world they lived in to the world that wanted them gone. The opening chapter of Red Dead Redemption 2 is titled Coulter, and we join the Vanderlin gang as they move achingly slow through a snowstorm. Things aren't looking good, and as they desperately search for shelter, we meet the main player protagonist, Arthur Morgan, who rides up to let Dutch know he's found a place they can hold up in just a little further down the trail. Historically, traveling through such poor conditions wasn't a great idea. Frostbite and other cold-related injuries and illnesses can affect even the hardiest of travelers, and we can only imagine how desperate they must have been to venture up into the mountains, knowing the low chances of survival that journey would entail. And that begs the question, how far would you go to preserve a dying way of life? We find out about the ferry robbery and the fact that it went very wrong early on in Chapter 1, so we can understand why the gang would need to flee. But their way of doing things is quickly becoming impossible as society grows and changes. Even the opening screens tell us that the outlaw way of life is coming to an end, so is it even worth the risk of dying in the mountains when facing inevitable change like that? As the gang files into one of the buildings in the ghost town of Coulter, we see them at what is likely the lowest point any of them have ever seen. They're on the verge of freezing to death. They have very little food or chances of finding food, and one of them has already died from some combination of wounds suffered in the escape and the cold. Dutch gives a speech, trying to rally everyone and give them some form of hope. But how much good that does is up for debate. At that point, most of them are probably wondering what their chances of actually making it out of the mountains are, and they are likely questioning if what they are going through will end in anything positive. As Arthur and Dutch ride back out into the storm to search for John and Micah, Arthur tries to question what happened at the ferry job, and Dutch makes a point of telling Arthur he needs his help to bring everyone through this situation. Loyalty is important to Dutch, and he knows that hard times like being stuck in a blizzard with no sign of a way out could threaten the group and his leadership. This is a theme we'll see a lot of as we go through the story. Dutch makes a lot of speeches, mostly centered around rallying the gang behind one idea or another. And anytime anyone questions him or his ideas, he accuses them of losing faith in him and not being loyal. But the Vanderlin gang isn't the only group in the mountains. After a short ride through the snow, Arthur and Dutch run across Micah, who, like Arthur earlier, had been sent out to scout ahead. He's found a cabin that seems to be teeming with life, and as they approach it to inquire about some help for their predicament, they realize the group inside is made up of members of a rival gang known as the O'Driscolls. It turns out they took over the cabin forcefully, taking a woman named Sadie hostage while killing her husband. Sadie will wind up being important to the story later on, but for now, she's a grieving widow who the gang chooses to protect. And that tells us a bit about who Dutch Vanderlin and his gang of misfits are. While some outlaw gangs might be made up of hardened criminals who come together because they enjoy causing chaos and sowing fear, the Vanderlin gang is made up of people who, for one reason or another, found themselves without a place to call home or a family to love. There are those like John Marston and Arthur Morgan, who were taken in by Dutch when they were young, as well as those like Pearson, the camp cook, who Dutch rescued from loan sharks, and Reverend Swanson, who was invited in after saving Dutch's life. Many of them were outcasts of society who just didn't fit into the world anywhere else. The early days of the gang were focused on helping the poor by robbing the rich, a sentiment borrowed from the mythical Robin Hood, and something that Dutch held as a justification for their actions and existence. This way of doing things wouldn't last, however, as Dutch would eventually give up on changing the world and choose instead to focus on putting the gang first. This is all important to the story overall because it builds the foundations of a group that is willing to do anything to survive. They're all extremely loyal to Dutch for taking them in when society shunned or exiled them, and they are desperate to hang on to the freedom and idealism that Dutch preaches. They are so loyal and desperate that they are willing to follow him into the mountains in the middle of a blizzard to escape the law that is only on them because Dutch did something horrible. In some ways, the Vanderlin gang resembles a cult. They follow a charismatic leader who preaches to them about how his way of doing things is the one true way and demands unquestioning loyalty and obedience. Questioning anything Dutch says is looked down upon, and there is some degree of control over who the gang members interact with outside of the group and how they spend their money and time. It isn't a true cult in the sense that members do have some autonomy and are able to come and go as they please, leaving entirely if they choose to. But the way that Dutch speaks to them and influences their way of thinking and living is a form of subliminal control that many cults aren't even able to achieve. Arthur takes a trip with Javier to find John, who's been missing for several hours in the storm, and the pair find their missing comrade on the side of a cliff, fighting to survive the cold and some pretty gnarly wounds given to him by a pack of wolves. Once John has been returned safely, it's time to find some food, and Arthur heads out on a hunting trip with Charles that teaches the player how to use a bow. While these missions seem like nothing more than tutorials and introductions on the surface, they actually serve to show just how hardy and strong the gang is at its core. John was able to survive being attacked by wolves in the middle of a blizzard in the mountains for an entire night, a feat that not many would be able to pull off while living to tell the tale. Arthur and Charles are able to provide food for the group even in the harshest of conditions, where a trip to the grocery store wasn't exactly an option. And this is all without Dutch even needing to be involved in any way. You could take away his teachings and still have that hardy, survivalistic ability that would actually give the group pretty decent chances of making things work outside of society without needing to rob and murder. And that's something that we can start to really notice, even this early in the story, as the missions that don't involve the gang's namesake have a different feel to them. Those first couple of outings felt like they had a purpose, something that would ultimately lead to a net positive for the group. The next thing that we leave the camp for is based on Dutch, though, and involves hunting down his arch-nemesis Colm O'Driscoll. This mission sees Arthur and most of the rest of the men ride through the mountains to another small ghost town in search of Colm and his men. Ultimately, they find their target and wipe out a whole group of O'Driscolls before discovering plans that will lead to the first train robbery of the game. But this outing doesn't really provide a benefit to the gang as a whole. No one is saved, no resources are gained. We end in basically the same way that we started. On the way back to camp, we run across a stray O'Driscoll gang member. But instead of shooting this one, we capture him and take him prisoner in hopes of finding out more about what Colm and his group were planning in regard to the train robbery. A few days pass and the snow starts to melt. And in reality, the smart thing to do would be to head down out of the mountains and try to flee as far from the law as possible. But Dutch can't do things the easy way. He insists that they need more money to make things work, even as Hosea is warning him about the train that they are about to rob. The man who owns the train is one Leviticus Cornwall, an oil magnate who doesn't mess around when it comes to his money. If robbing the ferry put them on the map with the law, robbing Cornwall would be painting a bullseye that they wouldn't be able to shake. The warning falls on deaf ears, however, and the robbery goes on with only a couple of hiccups as the dynamite meant to stop the train fails and the gang has to improvise. They wind up getting away with some bearer bonds that could eventually be sold for cash, but once again, the mission is mostly a fruitless endeavor. And if you really think about it, out of the 5 missions that we've seen in Chapter 1, 3 involved Dutch, and none of those really gained us anything, while the 2 that didn't involve him saved one member of the group's life and scored some food to help the gang survive. We know that the gang is perfectly capable of surviving, getting their own food and making enough money to get by without breaking any laws. We've seen that even this early on. So what's the point of following Dutch and remaining as outlaws? As the snow melts and the gang makes their way east into the rising sun, the air isn't the only thing heating up. Chapter 1 showed us the gang's strengths and potential weaknesses, but Chapter 2 is where we start to see the first cracks in the foundation. But that is for next week. Between now and then, head down into the comments and answer this question. If the very way of life that you knew was coming to an end, how far would you choose to go to preserve that life? And at what point is it better to just accept change and move forward? This is something that generations of people have struggled to answer because the world is ever changing, and the world we live in today will inevitably be different 50 years from now. Technology improves, societal norms shift and evolve, and the freedoms that we take for granted today might wind up not being there tomorrow. After you comment, remember to like the video and subscribe to Lost in Games here on YouTube so that you don't miss out on any future videos. I cover a wide variety of games, both here in the Philosophy and Ethics in Games series and in other series like Unscripted and Friend or Foe. If you want to help support the channel in a more tangible way, providing some help with getting new games and hard drives to store those games on, I've got channel memberships here as well as a Patreon linked in the description. Joining either of those gets your name in the video, early access, and behind-the-scenes content that no one else gets to see. That's all I've got for now. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.